Dear TESOL Ukraine community, we are thrilled to announce the Teacher Development Winter-Spring series of webinars, a transformation program designed to enhance our skills and knowledge in English language teaching. Our plan is to meet twice a month on Fridays at this time, 7 p.m., offering a unique blend of insights from both esteemed professionals of ELT, like our today's guest professor, and talented Ukrainian educators. And it's a great pleasure for me today to start the first session of the TESOL Ukraine Teacher Development Series of webinars 2024. And today we have, as Marina already mentioned, world-renowned speaker, Professor Dr. Andy Curtis, from City University of Macau now. And I believe this online webinar workshop is a real gift for all the members of TESOL Ukraine, English language teachers at universities, secondary schools. Professor Curtis' participation in the project is an expression of deep support for Ukraine and in particular for English teachers community, as well as, of course, for our students during these hard times. Today's presentation is devoted to considerations of the problems of intercultural communication and communicative competence forming. This is the issue which is really important for mutual understanding, mutual respect, and peaceful coexistence of different people and peoples in our today turbulent world. First of all, I would like to present, to give a very short presentation of our guest, Professor Dr. Andy Curtis. From the year 2015 to 2016, Dr. Andy Curtis served as the 50th president of TESOL International Association. In 2016, he received one of the association's 50 to 50 awards when he was voted one of the 50 most influential figures in the field over the first 50 years of association. Over the last 30 years, Dr. Curtis has co-authored or co-edited more than 200 publications presented in 50,000 language educators in 100 countries. And his work has been read by 100,000 language educators, imagine, in 150 countries. His recent books include Reflecting on Leadership in Language Education, published in the year 2022, and The New Peace Linguistics, and the Role of Language in Conflict, published in the same year 2022. The New Peace Linguistics and the Role of Language in Conflict. And currently he is a specially appointed professor in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at the City University of Macau in China. And the title of our today's webinar is developing intercultural communication competence, communicative competence, I'm sorry, in the foreign language classroom. In this invited online webinar for TESOL Ukraine, we will start by briefly considering what we mean by culture in relation to intercultural communication, especially as it relates to the foreign language classroom. We will also look at how discussions of intercultural communication have evolved over the years, from its earliest application back in the year of 1930s to the present day, and how foreign language teaching and learning can make use of pedagogical approaches related to the development of intercultural communication and intercultural competence. So, our dear Professor Curtis, the floor is yours, and we are thrilled and looking forward to participating in the webinar.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you to everybody who has joined us your Friday evening there, Friday at noon here in Canada. I'm just going to share my screen with you to make sure that everybody can see. Thank you for following the instructions and turning your microphones off for now, but I'm hoping to have an interactive session. Let me see if you can all see that okay. I'm assuming everybody can see the slide. I can see you if I scroll down. So first, of course, thank you very much for this opportunity to be with you. The question of where any of us are at any given time is hard to say now. I've been teaching online for more than a decade, but especially since COVID went global. So I still prefer being in a room full of people in person. I don't think any technology will ever replace that. I really do believe that after more than 10 years of teaching online, there's still nothing like walking into a room full of people and having that moment when you make that first connection. That is, of course, very difficult to do online, but I would love us to be able to make that connection as much as possible as the technology allows. So thank you very much to TESOL Ukraine for putting this together at relatively short notice. And I hope this will be the first of a series of talks. It's a massive topic, culture, developing intercultural communication and competence in the classroom. It is especially relevant, as Olena said, in the very turbulent world in which we live today. So I will get going. I hope you feel free to type your questions into the chat bar. I will leave some time at the end for some short questions. I know we try and keep the session to an hour, and I know you're busy there. It is your Friday night. It's probably been a very long and busy week for you. So I will try to make the most of our time together. As was alluded to and mentioned earlier, these are very difficult times for teachers and students there and in a number of countries. So I'm grateful that we have this kind of technology that can bring us together in some way to create some form of community. I've written and talked in online teaching about the difference between contact and connection. We may not have physical contact with each other, but we must stay connected with each other. So it's a difficult situation there. In Canada, as some of you may know, there is a very deep and long connection between Canada and Ukraine. Outside of Ukraine and Russia, Canada has the largest population of Ukrainian people in the world. people from the Ukraine started coming to Canada in the 1890s. So the most recent census data, which is from a few years ago, notes that well over 1.2 million people of Ukrainian origin live here. So for Canadians, we have been following your situation, the war, for the last 2 years now very closely. And many of my friends and colleagues here in Canada are of Ukrainian origin. I don't know how many of you use music in your language classrooms. I know some of you teach in schools, some in universities, some at colleges. I don't spend as much time in the language classroom as I would like to. I'm learning Chinese now. I divide my time between Canada and China. So if you're talking about intercultural communication, yeah, that's a very big factor in my learning of Chinese as I commute between China and Canada. So I assume many of you have used music in your language classrooms if you're language teachers. So a song that I sometimes play and sometimes sing, but I won't sing today, fortunately for you. It's a song I kind of remember hearing when I was a small child. And the idea is that you're everywhere and nowhere, baby. So when people ask me about culture and intercultural communication, the first question I have to ask is, what do they mean by culture? It's this very unusual thing, and that it is everywhere all the time, but it may be nowhere in particular. So let me ask you, just because we're not physically in a room together doesn't mean we can't connect with each other. So the question at the bottom of the first slide, what is culture and what is not culture? Feel free to type a short answer into your chat bar. I think there's about 99 of you and one of me, but I'm going to keep an eye on the chat bar. So if you could come up with a 1 or 2 or 3 word response to what is culture, and in particular, what isn't culture. If culture is everything and everywhere all the time, but nowhere in particular, how do we talk about it? So let's see some of the answers coming in. National etiquette. Wow, I have not seen that, but I like it. A kind of national etiquette. Yeah, that's beautiful. I'm not even sure I fully understand what it means, but I do like it very much. So that's one of the joys of language, right? You don't have to necessarily understand every word to really enjoy it. So a kind of national etiquette as rules, sometimes unwritten, very important, that they are supposed to be how we're supposed to behave. Recurring themes there of custom, cultures, ideas, social behavior, beliefs, values, as Victoria said, manifestations of human intellectual and emotional achievements, tradition, religion, values, a lot of these things come up. So let me ask you then, and thank you very much for all those postings. You can feel free to keep posting. Yulia pointed out the question of stereotypes, and I'm glad someone mentioned language, Tatiana. It's you can't really have culture without language, as we know, and you can't have language without culture as part of our national identity. Did anyone want to type into the chat bar what is not culture? As Lamechka said, it's our roots, but what is not culture? Arts, food, of course, cuisine, religion, shared beliefs. Anyone going to try and answer the question, what is not culture, or where in our daily lives is not culture? So, Irina, and my apologies for my pronunciations. References there to the propaganda, of course. That is a very interesting comment, and I understand it and appreciate it. The one that's come up is nature, and you've posted about nature. So when I look out the window here from my room in our home in Kingston, Ontario, Canada, I got back to Canada a few days ago from China. There's a huge snowfall, and there's a lot of snow and rain. It's quite beautiful. So that's nature. And one of the few answers that I've had is that the natural world is not part of the culture we create. It is part of us, but that's the closest I've come to getting an answer saying what is not culture, where people have said that it's nature, what we can see that is not human made. I guess that's what they're trying to say. So we need to be clear what is culture, and it's helpful sometimes to say what isn't culture. So cultural artifacts, there's a lot of discussion about cultural artifacts and the idea that anything made by human beings, whether it's food or language or poetry or pain or blood or love, anything made by humans may count as a cultural artifact. The abstract you've already seen, that's a bit of my professional context. One reason that I'm very happy to be invited to talk about intercultural communication, though it is admittedly a massive topic, is because like many of you, I don't just study intercultural communication. I live and breathe it on a daily basis. That is a recent family photo, and there are several cultures there. Behind us, that was a recent family photo taken here in our home. Behind us is a famous Chinese poem, and the character that you may be able to see, that main character means family. So it's a family photo. There's myself in the photo representing India and England and South America. My wife and her family are from Beijing and across China. Our daughter-in-law is from Bogota, Colombia. So my son from Beijing married a woman from Bogota, and the little boy on the left there is the only Canadian-born member of our family, him and the dog. Nobody else in that photo was actually born and raised here in Canada, though that is where we all live and work now. So the grandson is 2.5 years old. He is Canadian, Chinese, Colombian, Anglo-Indian. At 2.5 years, our goal is that by the age of 4, he will have 4 languages, because his mom speaks to him in Spanish from Bogota, Colombia. His dad speaks to him in Chinese from Beijing. At daycare, he speaks English, and I am in charge of his French. So the idea is that our grandson, like many young children, will have many languages, and that obviously, as we know, as language educators, as language teachers and learners, that may be some sort of key to world peace, is for interracial relations, producing a generation of people who have grown up with the notion of multiple languages and multiple cultures, who have grown up in a world where people are able to live together peacefully, in spite of the fact that they speak different languages, different cultures, they may worship differently, they may pray differently, they may eat different foods. So this is a topic that I don't just teach and learn. This is a topic that I have been living every day of my life whenever the family gets together, as we will do next week. As some of you may know, next week is Chinese New Year, the Year of the Dragon. My son is 36. He's the tall one on the left there. 36 is a big deal because it's every 12 years. So I'm going to talk a lot about context. This is one of a number of books that I helped to write. This on the back is the author. I was the editor of a 9-book series from TESOL Press called English Language Teaching in Context. And as you can see there, it says context is everything. So in preparation for today, I spent a lot of time learning what I could about your context, about your where you are and who your students are, and the kinds of experiences you're having. There's a couple, I don't know if any of you know this couple, please do put me in touch with them. they have collected teachers' stories. They started collecting them about a year ago, 1 year after the war began, coming up to the second anniversary. So you may be familiar with their website. You may be familiar with their stories. I was reading the stories of some of you, of some of the teachers there, Mariana, Alice, Julia, and Anna, on their website. I also, because of my interest in context, when I realized I'd be talking to a group of up to 100 Ukrainian teachers and professors and researchers, I read as much as I could research that was published by Ukrainian teacher researchers about the topic today. Most of the articles are written in Ukrainian, but many of the articles have an English abstract and an English summary. So I've been spending my time reading papers like this, and I'd be certainly interested to know if any of the authors are present with us today, or if any of you are familiar with these research papers. After 30 years of traveling around the world and presenting in many different countries, I'm often surprised at how the teachers in that particular country haven't necessarily had time to read the research being published about what they're doing, about their daily lives and about their classrooms. So I'm hoping to have a number of questions, but as you know, as language educators, you don't have interaction without input. So part of my input was to talk a little bit about my interest in the topic, personally and professionally, to tell you what little I understand about your context, and you can teach me more, and to do the research. I'm a little upset when some presenters come to some countries and clearly haven't researched the country. They haven't put in the time to really learn about the context in which they're presenting. So I tend to not like those presenters very much, but I do like the presenters who really put in the time to study the context in which the participants live and work and teach and learn. So anyone know this paper? Any of the authors of the paper here? And that's okay. If they're not here and you don't know the paper, these are all available online. I'm not sure what your online access is, but this is a paper that I just found from doing web-based research using Google. So this paper is actually in the Journal of History, Culture, and Art Research, but they had an interesting notion of intercultural communication, the cultivation of the culture of tolerant relationships. And they talk about intercultural communicative competence, lessons in foreign language, general education establishments. Tolerance was a big word in intercultural communication. The notion of tolerating and being tolerant. I would say that our field, the field of intercultural communication, has moved on, has moved forward, and we don't just talk to people now about being tolerant. You should be tolerant. No, we should be more than tolerant. So I think part of the history of intercultural communication is how to tolerate other people who are very different from you. Well, that should be that shouldn't be a special course as such. That should be a part of human nature, is how we tolerate people who are different from us. My whole life, which is more than half a century, my whole life I have chosen to live as a visible minority, born and raised in England, lived and worked in 40 or 50 countries over the last 35 years. But almost everywhere I go, people don't look like me. People look different. When I go to South America, I'm usually mistaken for being from South America, but being a very poor person in South America, because rich South Americans have light skin and poor South Americans have dark skin. So in my work and in my world, I'm almost always assumed to be a foreigner. So I'm always learning the language, I'm always learning the culture. So this notion of tolerance and toleration, I think, was the early days of intercultural communication. I would say we have moved past that now, this idea of tolerance, to really understanding each other through language. Another paper that I spent some time with is by a Ukrainian teacher researcher, Marina Kolinko. I don't know if anyone of you know her or know the paper. So those are the details. TESOL Ukraine already has a copy of these slides, and I am very happy for them to post the slides on the TESOL Ukraine website, so you don't have to be taking too many notes. If these references are useful to you, then all of the slides will be there. I've tried to find the DOI number when I can. And Marina talked about the difference between distinction and inclusion. And in a lot of my work, as Alina mentioned, this is the book I labored over for many years, and it looks at how some of the most powerful people in the world use language to bring us together or to set us apart. There is this idea that as language teachers, we should help bring about world peace. I don't agree with that. I think language teachers are already very busy. I think if people are going to bring about world peace, it will be our world leaders. But what we can do as language educators is to look very, very carefully at their language and to look at the difference between what they say and what they mean, what they do and what they say. So that book was many years of writing about world leaders, mostly in the USA, and how their language helped to make peace or how their language helped to bring about war. And often the language was whether they chose to focus on the distinctions, language used to highlight our differences, versus language used to highlight our commonalities, our humanities. As I travel around the world, people often say to me, you know, what are the differences between students learning English in China and students learning English in Canada or elsewhere? So I'm often asked about the differences, but really in my world, what I see is more the similarities. And I think in our intercultural communication, we're using language, we're looking for language that highlights our commonalities, our humanities, and being very aware of language that highlights our differences, language that sets us apart, language that says they are different from us, language that creates this us and them dichotomy. So this Ukrainian researcher, Marina Kolinko, defined intercultural communication in this way: a complex of communicative ties within a cultural environment, which many of you commented on in your earlier postings, that influences changes in the content and boundaries of communicative interaction. And she has this phrase, the manifestation of the other. So for most of my entire lifetime, I have been the other. I have been the person who looks different, who sounds different, who speaks differently, who thinks differently, which is perhaps why my family is such a mixture of many different languages and cultures, because as some of you know, life is a lot easier if you marry someone who looks like you and sounds like you. But life is a lot more interesting if you marry someone who looks and sounds very different from you. But you do have to get very good at conflict resolution, whether you're a language teacher or not. So I'll be interested to hear in today's talk from some of you who, like me, live intercultural communication every day of your life because of the people you've chosen to be with. This particular researcher I thought was important because she was in conflict zones. She was a direct witness to events such as evacuation from conflict zones. She looked at a lot of what she calls all Ukrainian sociological surveys. So how we make sense of culture, how we understand culture, and how we bring that with us into our classrooms, into our lives as teachers and learners. So I was very interested in this particular paper. If you haven't read it and you are interested in this topic in your context, I think this is a really helpful paper. And as I said, the details of all of the papers that I'm going to refer to are on the slides, so you can find them and feel free to follow up. She gets a little theoretical in her discussion, but she does specifically looking at the intercultural communication of settlers in the Donbass region. Now, of course, this research was carried out in 2019, and the world is a very different place. Your world, my world, our world is a very different place from 2019. But this is the particular group that she was looking at. And so when I was reading through these papers, I was thinking of the notion of additive bilingualism, additive multilingualism versus subtractive multilingualism, which is a topic we can get into more. But certainly when I think of intercultural communication, I think of the idea that additional languages and cultures are seen positively, whereas subtractive is additional languages and cultures are seen negatively. They're seen as different. They're seen as a threat. My own background is actually in clinical medical biochemistry. Before I became a language teacher, I worked in hospitals in England, obstetrics, gynecology, and pediatrics, which is a fairly unusual background for a language teacher, but it did give me a profound understanding of the nature of our world and the fact that from a purely biological perspective, from a purely cellular perspective, purity is in fact death. At the biological perspective, I'm not taking a political position, I'm talking as a life scientist. From a biological perspective, diversity is strength and diversity is life. So as some of the countries I go to, they ask me, how do we preserve the purity of our language and culture? And I give a short talk about my life as a life scientist, in which highly purified forms of biological entities had no environmental adaptive abilities. It was the impurities that gave us our strength. It is the differences of languages and cultures coming together that makes culture strong. This notion of purity in language and culture has been a troubling development, one that I've written about, one that I've researched, and one that I very vigorously oppose. So Kalinko drew some conclusions about intercultural competence and how what she called communicant settlers, which is an interesting term, immigrants, essentially, immigrants coming from, for example, I think in some cases from Uzbekistan and many other countries before the war, coming to the Ukraine, and Ukrainian people going to other countries. So obviously she highlighted the importance of the knowledge of Ukrainian language and this commonality of civic identity. So I liked her research and her conclusions. Another more recent study, again, those are all the authors and those are their departments. So when I say that I am very interested in context, I really do study the context of where I'm going to be, even if it's only in a virtual setting. So this is an interesting paper, which some of you may know, where they were looking at Chinese students in Ukraine learning English for agricultural purposes, which I was not expecting to find as a paper. So if you know the paper, please feel free to comment on it, or if you know any of the authors. So that was looking to some extent at some of the challenges and some of the barriers of intercultural communication. You will know this university, probably, Sumi National Agrarian University. And because many parts of China are still very agrarian, are very much based, as many parts of many countries are, on farming. And so they were looking at the language of agriculture as used in English by Chinese students in a Ukrainian context, which it really took me a while to wrap my mind around that. They looked at the use of idioms and idiomatic language. And again, in all of these studies about culture and intercultural communication, language, of course, comes up very strongly, even if the papers are not written by language teachers, even if they're written by people in very different disciplines. The use of language to bring us together, the use of language to highlight our common humanity versus the use of language to divide us, to separate us, to make us focus on our differences. That comes up a lot in my work and in my everyday encounters with people of different languages and cultures. So another paper, also quite recent, on social media and the role of social media. And some of you, especially if you're working with possibly younger learners, may find that they're using a lot of social media and they're getting a lot of language input through social media. So that was another recent paper. And again, if you're interested in your context or learning how social media is affecting intercultural communication in your own context, those are, I think, some very interesting papers. It's basically the same group of people. I don't know how many of you are under pressure to publish, but it's the same group of people with a slightly different angle. But again, it's this interesting mixture of Ukrainian, English and Chinese in the context of agrarian and agricultural language. They found social media to be quite helpful in the development of intercultural communication and of intercultural communicative competence. In my book, I do not agree. Every single time I write the word social in that book, I write the word anti-social. So in my book, I always write this. So whenever I write it in my book or in my work or on my slides, I always put the anti in brackets. And I can see that many of you are also under pressure to publish. So this is one of those examples where they took the same data set from a slightly different angle and published another paper on it. Still very interesting papers to read. The note that somebody mentioned early on in our time together today, etiquette, and you can see that the idea of etiquette comes up there. So I have found social media to be very much a mixed blessing when it comes to intercultural competence. I think a lot of negative stereotypes have been spread through social media. I think a lot of just straightforward lies have been spread through social media. So I find social media, to use a deliberately military metaphor, a double-edged sword. Social media can help create greater intercultural competence and understanding, but it can also fiercely reinforce negative stereotypes, lies, and misinformation. So in the conclusion of their second paper on this same topic, they wrote about, and again, this was in 2021, we're now in 2024, all of us, especially those of you there, are living in a very different context to that which we lived in 2021, which for much of the world was the height of the COVID, the global pandemic of COVID. There are worse things than a global pandemic, of course, and war is one of them. But this was their conclusions regarding this trilingual group. They noted democratic, uncritical, open-minded style of communication that allowed participants to build informal cooperation. Again, this idea of developing tolerance, I would say it's more, rather than the word tolerance, in my work, I use the word empathy. I write a lot about empathy rather than tolerance. There's sympathy, there's empathy, and I think both of those go beyond the notion of tolerance. So I could keep talking about this stuff for a long time, but I didn't really come here I didn't go there to show you my slides. We're going to post those slides somewhere, but I did come to share with you some of the work I've been studying, some of the work I've been doing. This is because of my connections to Asia. This is, please don't read this book. It's old and expensive and not relevant to you, but it's very pretty and very heavy. And it was an interesting book about intercultural communication in Asian contexts. That book is from a while ago, but having shared some of a tiny sliver, really, of this massive field of culture and intercultural communication, I did want to keep my promise to give you the opportunity to ask some questions. This is where you can turn. Maybe I'll stop sharing the screen. Do you think I should stop sharing the screen? Sometimes I do that and then people want to go back to a slide. But if I stop sharing the screen, I can see more of you. So I'm going to stop sharing there and invite people to either unmute their microphone briefly or to post a question into the chat bar. I would love to, I can see many of your images. I would love to hear what you sound like. I should also say that this is even more international than we were expecting, as one of my former graduates, Aviva Ueno, is actually joining us live today from Tokyo, Japan. Thank you, Aviva, for joining us from Tokyo, Japan, and really making this even more international and intercultural than it would otherwise have been. So thank you very much to our Japanese participant. Thank you, Aviva. And if anyone would like to unmute their microphone, we have about 10 or 12 minutes. I can stay a bit longer, but I would encourage you to keep your questions as clear and concise as possible so that we can hear from as many of you as possible. It's possible that some of you are too shy. I think that's highly unlikely. But if you would rather type a message into the chat bar, I'm looking at it now, or if you'd like to unmute briefly, ask a message, ask a question, I would be happy to hear from you and happy to reply.
Well, if you don't mind, I would like to ask a question.
Please, Alina.
Possible? Thank you. Well, for me, it's such a great deal to listen to you today, because currently I'm in Canada just for a short visit. And my impression, I am staying with my daughters. Well, and my first visit to Canada was something melting pot. So many people of different nations and nationalities. And I thought that we are different. But thanks to your lecture and to your point of view, I am sure that now I must have been focused on the similarities. And really, it's so cool. You have transformed my mind. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Which part of Canada are you in right now?
I'm in Edmonton now.
Ah, okay. So that's quite a diverse city.
Sure.
As with many cities in that part of Canada, the reason they're diverse is because immigrants came for work. And so they have this long history of immigration. So so your daughters live there, you said, or?
No, she's staying in Canada as a refugee, you see, from the war of Ukraine.
Yes, of course.
Well, but she's doing fine. That's why for me it is important just to have an idea what kind of country Canada is, and it's cool. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I should have had this talk sponsored by the Canadian Tourism Board, but and we do have our problems here. But yeah, we have Canada as a country has a long history with Ukraine, and I know personally and professionally many people who have welcomed people from Ukraine to come and spend some time with us, maybe make a new life here or bring their new life back to their former country. So thank you so much, Alina, for that comment from within Canada.
Yeah. Sorry, I just swept your. How long? Thank you. Bad connection. Sorry.
That's okay. Thank you again, Alina. Lovely to meet you. And please give my best to your daughter.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Great. Thank you.
Bye, Alina. Well, that was
Sorry,
unexpected.
may I continue the topic of Canada? Maybe you
Yeah.
will be greatly surprised that my first teacher, and I started to learn English when I was 7, was immigrant from Canada. And he came to Ukraine and he worked as a translator, and his idea was to open school to share his knowledge and skills of using English just as a native speaker. And I listened to the different, imagine it was 1967, I'm not so young, but nevertheless, you see the world is round and everything you see in our life is repeating. But the question is, I remember his accent when he spoke Ukrainian, and now you decided to share your knowledge with us, with Ukrainians. And I know the Canadian diaspora, it is rather one of the largest in the world.
Yeah.
May, do you have any stereotype about Ukrainians? Looking at the Canadian Ukrainians.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
For us, it will be very interesting.
Okay. Well, that's a great, thank you, Irina, for that question. As I mentioned during the talk, we do have to be very careful of stereotypes, both positive and negative. But what I can say, and it's something I go into more detail when I'm doing in-depth workshops with international groups on intercultural communication, is the Ukrainian people that started coming to Canada in the late 1890s have established themselves as an essential part of Canadian life, particularly that part of Canada, because they came essentially as farmers. And Canada had a lot of farmland that local Canadian, I mean, the immigrants from England and from other countries were not as good at working the land, not as good at making the land so productive. So that part of Canada, I would say, if there is a stereotype, it's a very positive stereotype, which is that had the Ukrainian community not come to that part of Canada, it might not be as rich agriculturally. So the positive stereotype when I go to that part of Canada and I meet many third and fourth and fifth generation Ukrainians, is that they took a part of Canada that in some ways nobody wanted, turned it into this very rich and fertile farming land, and have, as a result, the positive stereotype of being extremely hard-working and very good stewards of the land as we deal with our current environmental crisis. So the stereotypes I have are very positive. But even then, I'm very careful with my stereotypes. But thank you so much for the question and for that memory from 1967. Wow, that's wonderful.
Thank you. You will compare, reflect at the end of our course. And I hope we are making video recording. You will listen to your beginning words. What did you think about Ukrainians? It's a little bit to relax everyone and enjoy your webinar. Really, it's great.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go to the chat bar. There's Natalia from Northern Ukraine. Which aspect of language is the most important? Sorry about the bad cam connection. No, thank you so much for being here in the textual presence. Intercultural communication, I would say, and it's a great question, and thank you for persisting even without the cam. I would say listening. I really would say that a lot of the Natalia was asking about which of the modalities, speaking, listening, reading, writing, for intercultural, and I would actually say that listening most of the communication breakdowns that I see, and that includes within my own family of many languages and cultures, most of the communication breakdowns I see often are to do with a lack of listening patience. We hear something, we understand it, we identify with it, and we want to reply. But I try to teach myself to be more patient when I'm listening. So I would say thank you very much for the question. And when it comes to intercultural communication, I would say listening. As one of my students told me many years ago, she said we have one mouth and two ears so that we may listen twice as much as we speak, which I thought was a very lovely way of putting it. Also, to the chat bar, finding a healthy balance, wow, between preserving European host countries, benefiting from other cultures. The particular set of cultures that you're referring to are Islamic and Muslim refugees. And a reference to the Deer Hunter movie, yes, which I have seen, but I'm not going to comment on because that was a long time ago. The yeah, this balance, as you can see, as you know, a number of countries, a number of other countries in Europe are moving to the right. The recent protests in Germany with the so-called AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland. In Germany, there has been a huge political move to the right against, in many ways, against the massive immigration of people from Syria and Turkey and elsewhere. So I am, in my work and in my life, concerned as I look to countries like the United States, to countries in Europe, and see this movement towards the right, which is often based on a lot of anti-immigration rhetoric. And obviously, all anti-immigration rhetoric is language-based. You can't have rhetoric without language. So maintaining, it's another great question about maintaining a healthy balance between preserving our histories and our languages and welcoming new languages. And I would say that the English language itself is probably the best example of that, because there is, as far as I know, no other language that has so many loan words from so many languages. So one of the reasons that English might be considered a very rich language is very, very importantly because of all the other words that it has incorporated from all the other languages. So it's a great question. It's a big question, but it's an important question about how we preserve our own languages and cultures and identities whilst welcoming others, because that is, again, from a biological perspective, that is how things develop and grow. So countries like Canada, like England, like Japan, in those countries, far more people will die today than will be born. We are aging populations in Canada, England, America, Japan, many countries. So if we don't want our countries to die, we need to have intelligent, compassionate immigration policies. And as part of those policies will be linguistic and cultural support. So that's how I see that balancing act at the national and at the international level. Countries that are essentially dying need new blood. They need new languages. They need new cultures. They need new people. The question is how to do that in ways in which we mutually benefit rather than feel at times understandably threatened by differentness. I write a lot about differentness, that differentness is seen as dangerous. If someone is different, then they're not just different, they're dangerous. If someone does something differently, they're not just doing it differently, they're doing it not as well as we are, or they're doing it not the way we do, they're doing it not the way it should be done. So I know we need to wrap this up. but I'm still looking at the chat bar. Difficulties adapting to a new culture. Yes. Every aspect of life that you can think of, from food to language to music, is a difficulty. As you saw from the photo, half of my family is from Asia and China and elsewhere, so I'm constantly challenged. I can't think of a single aspect of a new culture that I do not find challenging. Let's put it like that. Even walking down the street in a different culture can be. People will say, "No, you're walking on the wrong side of the road," or "You're walking too quickly," or "You're walking too slowly." So there is no aspect of adapting to a new culture that is not difficult. But I find the more I learn the language at a deeper level, the more I can embrace the language, the more I find the cultural difficulties become less difficult. I hope that makes sense. Because I love words that don't translate. There are so many phrases that don't translate from one language to another because the thing they're referring to is so particular to that culture. So my way of dealing with every single challenge of a new culture is to immerse myself in the language as much as I possibly can. So that's to that question. Military personnel, combat operations, mutual understanding. Certainly for better and for worse, English is an international language. Every single air traffic controller in the world, including Ukrainian and Russian air traffic controllers, they all have to use English. So English is a lingua franca in the field of aviation. To some extent, English is a lingua franca in the field of military personnel and combat operations. This may be a point where English as a mutually understandable language. We know from research that most of the language produced in the world today will not be produced by native users of English. We know that. Roughly 3 out of every 4 words of English produced in the world today will be produced by non-native users. So that's made a problem. That can be a problem, but I think when there is conflict, when there is especially military and armed conflict, it can be helpful for both parties to be functioning in a third language. Nelson Mandela said that when you speak to a man in a language he understands, you speak to his brain. When you speak to a man in a language he loves, you speak to his heart. So I think language can be a source of great conflict, but I also believe that language, including English, can be a way to resolve conflict without massive loss of life. Okay, I'm going to, I know there are still questions. I'm so grateful for you all to be staying with me on your Friday night. This will be the first of a series of talks, and I hope one day to meet some of you in person. In the meantime, I will do one last check. Is it true that Chinese prefer is it true that talking of stereotypes, is it true that Chinese prefer non-native English language to? On that note, I will wrap it up. Traveling all over China, as I do these days, and having a Chinese members of the family, I would say that most of my young Chinese learners want teachers of English who are interested in learning Chinese, who are interested in seeing language as a cultural exchange, who are not interested in seeing English as something they have as a gift that they share with the rest of the world. So most of the young people in China I know, when I present myself as an English teacher, the first question they ask is, are you learning Chinese? And I have to say, yes, truthfully, I am teaching English, but I am learning Chinese. So I think a lot of young people that I know in China, they don't mind if you're native or non-native users. They're not too concerned about that. But what they are concerned is that you see language teaching and learning as a two-way street, that you see it, if you're there teaching English in their country, well, then you should also be learning their language as a mark of respect, and so that you can understand their difficulties. Okay, I know it's getting late. I hate to leave you. I will see you all again very soon. I don't know whether I am to pass it back to your president, to Elena, for some closing words, but thank you all very, very much. This has been such a lovely, important and meaningful experience for me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
See you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Greatly enjoyed, really.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you all.
Lucky
And,
gift.
next time we will meet for Ukrainian speakers to share their ideas, and we will
Yes.
see Andy on the 1st of March. Again.
Yes, I will
Thank
see you
you.
on the 1st of
Thank
March.
you
Take
very
care. Stay
Thank
safe, huh?
Thank you.
You
You
will
too.
find.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Namaste.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.